Unit 1, The Capitalist Revolution. In this chapter, you will study how capitalism revolutionized the way we live and how economics attempts to understand this and other economic systems. Figure 1.1a shows rapid sustained growth in average living standards since 1700. How did this happen? To compare living standards in each country, we use a measure called GDP per capita, shown on the vertical axis. People obtain their incomes by producing and selling goods and services. GDP, gross domestic product, is the total value of everything produced in a given period, such as a year, so GDP per capita corresponds here to average annual income. GDP per capita is simply GDP divided by the population of the country. GDP is also referred to as gross domestic income. In figure 1.1a, the height of each line is an estimate of average income at the date on the horizontal axis for 5 different countries: Britain, Japan, Italy, China, and India. You can see that there was barely any change in living standards till 1650 to 1700, and then it increased very rapidly, first in Britain, then in Italy and Japan, and very recently in China and India. So how did this happen? What was the role of capitalism and technology and the various institutions that governments put in place? Why did some countries like Britain start to grow earlier than others? What can poor countries do to catch up? In this chapter, you will study the role of capitalism and technological revolution in history's hockey stick growth and its negative consequences. Capitalism and technology provided the right incentives for countries to grow. However, economic inequality has increased both across countries and within countries. You will also see that governments play a major role in making sure that the economy has the right institutions in order to grow. Let us understand how unequal is the world. 1,000 years ago, the world was flat. Today there are large differences both within and across countries. While both types of inequality seem to have increased, differences in average income between countries are much larger today than they were in the past. Average income in Norway is 19 times the average income in Nigeria, and the poorest 10% in Norway receive almost twice the income of the richest 10% in Nigeria. We can link growing between country inequality to the hockey stick diagram, inequality and growth. For a very long time, living standards did not grow in any sustained way. When sustained growth occurred, it began at different times in different places. The countries that took off economically a century or more ago, UK, Japan, Italy, are now rich. The countries that took off only recently or not at all are in the flatlands, such as Liberia. The picture shows income inequality in 3 different years for all countries. What you can see is that in 1980, most of the world was still very poor. Along the horizontal axis, countries are arranged from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. China and India are among the poor, while UK, Norway, and US are among the richest. Going backwards along the z-axis, inequality within a country is shown by the height of the skyscrapers. You can see more skyscrapers in 2014 in all the countries, showing increasing income inequality within each country. Income inequality increased between countries as well. In Singapore, the richest country on the furthest right, the average incomes of the richest and poorest 10% are $67,436 and $3,652 respectively. In Liberia, the furthest left, the corresponding incomes are $994 and $17. We can calculate the 90-10 ratio to measure the degree of inequality. Take the average income of the richest 10% and divide it by the average income of the poorest 10%. In Singapore, this ratio would come to $67,436 divided by $3,652 equals 18.46. In Norway, this ratio is 5.4, indicating less inequality than in Singapore. Try to find the 90-10 ratio for Liberia. Is the income distribution in Liberia more or less equal than in Singapore and in Norway? Measuring income and living standards. Gross domestic product, GDP, a measure of total income and output of the economy in a given period, usually expressed in per capita terms as an average income. GDP per capita is not equal to disposable income. Disposable income equals total income minus taxes plus government transfers. Both are imperfect measures of well-being. Nominal GDP, value of everything produced for market in an economy in a year in that year's prices. Nominal GDP, NGDP equals price of a yoga lesson times number of yoga lessons plus price of a book times number of books plus price times quantity for all other goods and services. NGDP equals sigma PI QI over I. Goods and services are indexed by I, where P is the price and Q is the quantity. Sigma, capital Sigma, just means to add everything up. Calculating the growth rate. Often we are interested in the percent growth of a variable, whether that's GDP, bacteria in a dish, or population in a city. For a variable x in period t, the growth rate from the previous period t minus 1 is calculated as growth in x equals change in xt over xt minus 1 equals xt minus 1 over xt minus 1. Sometimes this is multiplied by 100 to put it in percentage terms. Example with real GDP. Real GDP in chain 2009 dollars per capita in the United States was $51,580 in the second quarter of 2016, $52,296 in the second quarter of 2017. What was the growth rate? Calculated as follows: $52,296 minus $51,580 divided by $51,580 equals $716 divided by $51,580 equals 0.01388. When multiplied by 100, we get 0.1388 times 100 equals 1.388 or 1.4%. Real GDP, comparing across time. Nominal GDP can go up or down either because quantities change or because prices change. We're generally interested in the real change, or how much or more or less we produced compared to last year. In order to do that, we need constant prices. We choose a base year and use the prices from that year. If we say something is real or measured in real, constant, or chain dollars, that means we've taken out the effect of price changes. Real GDP, comparing across countries. Because different countries have different currencies, we need to adjust real GDP measures to a common currency to compare across countries. We could use the exchange rate between the two currencies, but it can be very volatile. Countries also have different relative prices. Some things are cheaper in one country and some in another country. We use purchasing power parity (PPP) prices that adjust for these differences in relative prices. As the name suggests, the idea is to achieve parity, equality in the real purchasing power. Prices are typically higher in richer countries. One reason for this is that wages are higher, which translates into higher prices. Because prices of cappuccinos, restaurant meals, haircuts, most types of food, transport, rents, and most other goods and services are more expensive in US than in India, once a common set of prices is applied, the difference between GDP per capita in US and India measured at PPP is smaller than it is if the comparison is made at current exchange rates. A haircut in the US might cost $20 but only 150 rupees in India, whereas the official exchange rate is $1 equals 70 rupees. Hockey stick growth. Hockey stick curves represent the sustained rapid growth in GDP per capita experienced by countries worldwide. GDP growth rates. The graph shows the GDP growth rates for 5 countries, Britain, Japan, Italy, China, and India since the year 1000. The horizontal axis shows the years from 1000 to 2000. The vertical scale shows GDP per capita 1990 PPP dollars. The PPP rates could be considered as an estimate of what the exchange rate would have been if $1 would buy the same amount of goods and services in every country. The scale used is a ratio scale where GDP per capita doubling as we move up the vertical axis from $250 per capita per year to $500, then to $1,000, and so on. This is called a ratio scale because equal distances represent equal ratio between the two values. The ratio scale is used for comparing growth rates. When a ratio scale is used, a series that grows at a constant rate looks like a straight line. This is because the percentage or proportional growth rate is constant. A steeper line in the ratio scale chart means a faster growth rate. Timing of growth. Growth takeoff occurred at different points in time for different countries. Britain was the first country to experience sustained economic growth. It began around 1650. In Japan, it occurred around 1870. The kink for China and India happened in the second half of the 20th century. Understanding how this occurred has been one of the most important questions that economists have asked, starting with the founder of the field, Adam Smith, who gave his most important book the title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In some economies, substantial improvements in people's living standards did not occur until they gained independence from colonial rule or interference by European nations. The technological revolution. Technology. Economists use the term technology in a specific way. By technology they mean a process that uses inputs to produce an output. By reducing the amount of work time it takes to produce the things we need, technological changes allowed significant increases in living standards. Remarkable scientific and technological advances occurred more or less at the same time as the upward kink in the hockey stick in Britain in the middle of the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution refers to a wave of technological advances starting in Britain in the 18th century, which transformed an agrarian and craft-based economy into a commercial and industrial economy. For example, today the productivity of labor in producing light is 500,000 times greater than it was among our ancestors around their campfire. The graph shows how many lumen hours of light could be produced per hour of labor ratio scale from 100,000 years to today. Till about 40,000 years ago, there was barely any change. Campfire was the source of light. Then came use of animal fat, where productivity improved a little. Then around 1800, with discovery of electricity, productivity of labor in producing light increased 500,000 times. Industrial Revolution allowed new products to be produced with fewer resources, so instead of everyone being a farmer and producing enough food to survive, fewer people could produce all the food and more goods and services could be produced. A connected world. Technological progress also greatly improved the speed at which information travels, making the world more connected. The process of innovation did not end with the Industrial Revolution, as the case of labor productivity in lighting shows. It has continued with the application of new technologies in many industries, such as the steam engine, electricity, transportation, canals, railroads, automobiles, and most recently, the revolution in information processing and communication. These broadly applicable technological innovations give a particularly strong impetus to growth in living standards because they change the way that large parts of the economy work. Graph shows information traveled at about 1 mile per hour from the year 1000 to the year 1800 as between Egypt and Italy, about the pace at which someone can walk and take a message across. Then you can see how it increased at different times. These days, with the coming of internet, news can travel across the world instantly. The economy and the planet. The economy is one piece of society. Human society sits within the biosphere, representing all the living organisms on the planet. The biosphere lives on the physical environment of the planet Earth. All of these layers interact and affect each other, producing more of everything, including CO2. Our use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas has profoundly affected the natural environment. The graph shows, after having remained relatively unchanged for many centuries, increasing emissions of carbon dioxide (CO2), shown on vertical axis on the right side, into the air during the 20th century have resulted in measurably larger amounts of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, shown by the vertical axis on the left side. Environmental consequences. Increased production and population growth affects the environment. Chart shows Northern Hemisphere temperatures over the long run, 1000 to 2006. Since 1900, average temperatures have risen in response to increasingly high levels of greenhouse gas concentrations. These have mostly resulted from the CO2 emissions associated with the burning of fossil fuels. Climate change is a global change, but many of the environmental impacts of burning fossil fuel are local, as residents of cities suffer respiratory and other illnesses as a result of high levels of harmful emissions from power plants, vehicles, and other sources. Rural communities too are impacted by deforestation, another cause of climate change, and the depletion of the supply of clean water and fishing stocks. Technology may provide the solution. Advances in technology today may allow greater reliance on wind, solar, and other renewable sources of energy. Environmental consequences. These effects are results of both the expansion of the economy, illustrated by the growth in total output, the way the economy is organized, what kinds of things are valued and conserved, for example. The permanent technological revolution may also be part of the solution by making it possible to use less resources to produce more output. Capitalism. Along with the Industrial Revolution and the Technological Revolution came the Capitalist Revolution. There are lots of different flavors of capitalism around the world and throughout history. So we are going to focus on what the basics of any capitalist system are. The distinctive characteristic of capitalism comes from its institutions. By institutions we mean the laws and social customs governing the production and distribution of goods and services. Capitalism is an economic system where the main institutions are private property, markets, and firms. The picture shows that initially up to 1700 there was private property and production was mainly agricultural and self-sufficient. Then came markets which allowed for specialization and exchange to take place. However, it was the emergence of the firm that allowed the profit motive to work as an incentive to promote introduction of new and improved products and technologies. This made capitalism the engine of rapid growth. Capitalism refers not to a specific economic system, but to a class of systems sharing these characteristics. How the institutions of capitalism, private property, markets, and firms combined with each other and with families, governments, and other institutions differs greatly across countries. Just as ice and steam are both water, defined chemically as a compound of two hydrogen atoms bonded with one oxygen atom. China and the US are both capitalist economies, but they differ in the extent to which the government influences economic affairs and in many other ways. As this demonstrates, definitions in the social sciences often cannot be as precise as they are in the natural sciences. Let us understand what each of the key institutions of capitalism means. Private property means you have ownership rights over possessions. An important type of private property is capital goods, which refers to machines, tools, equipment and factories, the non-labor inputs used in production. Does not include some essentials, example air, knowledge that cannot be owned or bought and sold. Markets, a way for people to exchange products and services for their mutual benefit. Unlike other types of exchange, such as gifts or government transfers, markets are reciprocated transfers, usually exchange money for a good or service, are voluntary. Both people voluntarily exchange for mutual benefit, and usually there is competition. This is indeed a very important aspect for capitalism to function well. Large number of sellers in the market encourages better quality of products to be made available at lower prices. Firms, business organization that uses inputs to produce outputs and sets prices to at least cover production costs. Inputs and outputs are private property. Firms use markets to sell outputs. The aim is usually to make profit. A striking characteristic of firms, distinguishing them from families and governments, is how quickly they can be born, expand, contract, and die. The profit motive encourages firms to be efficient and to constantly innovate. Firms that are successful tend to expand, while others may contract or die in a capitalist system. The Capitalist Revolution. Capitalism led to growth in living standards because of impact on technology. Firms competing in markets had strong incentives to adopt and develop new technologies to make profits. Specialization. The growth of firms and the expansion of markets linking the entire world allowed historically unprecedented specialization in tasks and production. Together with the technological revolution, the capitalist revolution increased worker productivity, without which we could not have experienced the sustained growth in living standards. The gains from specialization. Specialization increases productivity of labor because we become better at producing things when we each focus on a limited range of activities. Specialization allows learning by doing, taking advantage of natural differences in skill and talent, economies of scale. People can only specialize if they have a way to acquire the other goods they need. In a capitalist society, this is done via markets. Theory of comparative advantage. Example to show gains from specialization and trade. Imagine two different individuals, Greta and Carlos. They differ in how productive they are in growing apples and wheat. If Greta spent all her time, say 2,000 hours in a year, producing apples, she would produce 1,250. If she only produced wheat, she would produce 50 tons per annum. Carlos has less fertile land than Greta for producing both crops. If he devoted all his time, the same amount as Greta, to apple growing, he would produce 1,000 per year, and if he produced only wheat, he would produce 20 tons. Although Carlos's land is worse for producing both crops, his disadvantage is less relative to Greta in apples than in wheat. Greta can produce 2.5 times more wheat as he can, but only 25% more apples. Economists distinguish who is better at producing what in two ways: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Greta has an absolute advantage in both crops. A person or country has this in the production of a good if the inputs it uses to produce this good are less than in some other person or country. Carlos has an absolute disadvantage. She can produce more of either crop than he can. Greta has a comparative advantage in wheat because she has to give up less apples to produce an extra ton of wheat compared to Carlos. Carlos has a comparative advantage in apples. He is less disadvantaged in production of apples because he has to give up less wheat to produce each ton of apple compared to Greta. Comparative advantage means a good can be produced at a lower opportunity cost than someone else. If they both specialize in producing the good in which they have a comparative advantage and trade, they will end up having more of both goods than if they tried to produce both goods themselves. The benefits of trade. Start by assuming that they do not trade. Each one produces both goods. Greta produces 500 apples and 30 tons of wheat. Carlos produces 300 apples and 14 tons of wheat. Total production is equal to 800 apples and 44 tons of wheat. Now if Greta specializes in wheat, produces 50 tons, while Carlos specializes in apples, produces 1,000 apples, then total production will be 1,000 apples and 50 tons of wheat, more than before. Suppose they agree to exchange 15 tons of wheat for 600 apples. Greta gives 15 bushels of wheat to Carlos in exchange for 600 apples. Greta will end up with 35 tons of wheat and 600 apples, and Carlos with 15 tons of wheat and 400 apples. Both have more of both goods than before specialization and trade. They could have agreed to some other mutually beneficial terms of trade. Terms of trade depend on bargaining power. The benefits of trade. All producers can benefit by specializing and trading goods, even when this means that one producer specializes in a good that another could produce at lower cost. Markets contribute to increasing the productivity of labor by allowing people to specialize. Specialization allows people in a capitalist economy to consume more than they otherwise could if they tried to produce everything they needed. Did capitalism cause the hockey stick growth? Economists cannot conduct lab experiments like natural scientists. However, sometimes the real world provides opportunities for economists to observe the results of differences in institutions on economic growth. These are called natural experiments. The division of Germany at the end of World War II into two separate economic systems, capitalist in the West and centrally planned in the East, gave us an opportunity to see the results of having different economic systems in East and West Germany on the standard of living in these countries many decades later. In 1936, before the Second World War, living standards in what later became East and West Germany were the same. The East German Communist Party forecast in 1958 that material well-being would exceed the level of West Germany by 1961. It did not. By 1989, you can see West German GDP per capita became much higher than that of East Germany. We cannot conclude from the German natural experiment that capitalism always promotes rapid economic growth, while central planning is a recipe for relative stagnation. Instead, what we can infer is more limited. During the second half of the 20th century, the divergence of economic institutions mattered for the livelihoods of the German people. Divergence in growth. If we look at another set of countries, we see that not all capitalist economies are equally successful. Argentina was the richest country till the 1970s, but has struggled since then. South Korea was able to grow very rapidly since the 1950s, but they did it under a military dictatorship, even though now they are a democracy. Yet the varieties of capitalism that replaced central planning in the countries that had once made up the Soviet Union did not work so well either. This is evident from the pronounced dip in GDP per capita for the former Soviet Union after 1990. Capitalist economies may fail because of economic conditions, where firms, private property, or markets fail if private property or contracts are not enforced. Political conditions, where there is corruption and failure to implement rule of law. Failure of government to provide essential goods and services, infrastructure, education, health services, financial institutions. In South Korea, government played a huge role in providing the institutions needed for growth. So the role of government is very important in most capitalist economies. Political systems. Capitalism coexists with many political systems. A political system determines how governments will be selected and how those governments will make and implement decisions. In most countries today, capitalism coexists with democracy. Individual rights of citizens, example freedom of speech, fair elections. But capitalism has coexisted with non-democratic systems too. China practices state capitalism where the government is not elected democratically, but they have the institutions of capitalism in place. China has experienced the hockey stick growth since the 1980s when capitalistic reforms were introduced. When capitalism struggles. Why capitalism is less dynamic, the explanation might be that private property is not secure. There is weak enforcement of the rule of law and of contracts, or expropriation either by criminal elements or by government bodies. Markets are not competitive. They fail to offer the carrots and wield the sticks that make a capitalist economy dynamic. Firms are owned and managed by people who survive because of their connections to government or their privileged birth. They did not become owners or managers because they were good at delivering high-quality goods and services at a competitive price. The other two failures would make this more likely to occur. The benefits of a dynamic capitalist system. In a nutshell, capitalism can be a dynamic economic system when it combines private incentives for cost-reducing innovation. These are derived from market competition and secure private property. Firms led by those with proven ability to produce goods at low cost. Public policy supporting these conditions. Public policy also supplies essential goods and services that would not be provided by private firms, and a stable society, biophysical environment, and resource base. The role of governments. There are many varieties of capitalism depending on the particular political system, example, type of democracy. The government's importance in the capitalist system differs so much among nations because political systems differ. One way to understand the role of government in an economy is to look at the share of government revenue in GDP. It varies greatly from 25% in Mexico to over 55% in Norway. In the US, it is about 33%, much smaller than in Norway. All these countries are capitalistic, but the role of government is much larger in some countries such as Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and other European countries. What is economics? The circular flow diagram gives us a simple picture of the working of an economy. Households and firms interact with one another. Firms produce goods and services and sell to households. Households are able to buy goods and services by providing labor to the firms. This interaction takes place within the larger biosphere that the economy sits in. We take land, raw materials, energy and water from the biosphere and produce pollution and waste which we need to be mindful of in our production decisions. Controlling environmental pollution is one of the biggest challenges economics will have to deal with in the near future. It is also important to note that some activity that happens in the economy does not get paid and therefore does not get measured. So work that you do at home, such as cooking, cleaning, or parents caring for children or the elderly, are not counted in the measure of GDP used to measure standard of living. Economics is the study of how people interact with each other and with the natural surroundings in producing their livelihoods and how this changes over time. Summary. In this chapter we saw 1. Important trends in economic variables over time. Income inequality across regions has increased a lot over time. Hockey stick growth in GDP and its negative consequences. Technological progress helped bring about these trends. Second, the adoption of capitalism was another key factor. Capitalism has three key institutions: private property, markets, firms. Failure of these institutions can explain divergence in economic growth across countries. Political systems and the role of government also determine the type of capitalist society a country adopts. Make sure you watch the video embedded in this chapter. The link is provided below: https://youtube/KMHAT_WUF54.